Hello. Welcome to episode 1 of the new podcast, Breadcrumbs. My name is Kevin Howard, and I'm going to be your host for this, what I hope to be an ongoing interactive conversation. So, before we dive in, I just want you to know this is going to be different than most podcasts you've seen before. Here, it's not going to be in some studio stylized with, blue screen behind me and all types of things. No, it's going to be shot in my home office, with me as clear as day for you to see, in the hopes that this can be a more intimate conversation about the issues that really impact our lives. So I'm not coming here as your host for this conversation. I'm not coming here presenting myself as an expert. I am not an authority, nor am I going to try to draw on authority to convince you of anything. What I am is your neighbor who's experienced 60 years of events that have affected both of our lives, your life, the lives of your family, your children, as they have affected mine. And that we're going to take that wellspring of shared experiences and the wellspring of our shared humanity, the things about us that make us similar. We're going to take that information and that body of experiences, and we're going to see if we can use that as the basis for trying to understand what the devil is going on in the world today. And so that's the overall basic proposition for the podcast Breadcrumbs. Now, for a more detailed overview of what the podcast is going to talk about, and how you can join the Breadcrumbs community over on Patreon, and even a more detailed background about your host, Kevin Howard, right? Please check out episode 0, which is also available here wherever you're getting this podcast. But for now, I'm going to stay as brief on the overview stuff so that we can jump into how we're going to have this conversation and then the content of episode 1. So, as I said, this is not going to be a conversation where I'm going to dump a load of data on you and expect you to just trust me or to believe me. The one advantage of modern technology is that most of us have smartphones, which for people as old as I am, I'll be 60 in November 30th, right? I grew up on Star Trek. I didn't, we have a tricorder in our phones. We have access to virtually all the available information out there, right? And augmented with artificial intelligence, with AI, we can use the chat bot to actually process data and get sourced information. So when we have these conversations, I am going to be drawing on many sources, but because we don't want to make this a doctoral dissertation, right? I'm not going to be citing the sources in the middle of our conversation. What I'm calling you to do, and I'm hoping this will be a part of your regular practice, is not believe anything I say, but easily verify it through the use of your chatbot and through the use of the search engines of your choice, because we can validate anything that anyone claims that all of us have been involved in that are subject to public source data, right? We can validate it pretty instantly, and we need to get into the habit of doing it, because this is one of the reasons why we find ourselves in the position we're in. So, first step, first ask of the podcast is check the data, not only my data, but to check the data of anyone that you're relying on. Okay. The next thing is I'm not expecting you to trust me, right? Hey, I'm a nice guy. I got a decent education. I was born and raised in America, served our country in different capacities, including the military. That's not the basis by which I want you to trust me. Or, basically what I want you to do is I want you, since we're going to tap into our shared experiences, right? And we're going to base our perspective on our shared humanity, things that each of us do that I don't expect when I start making claims and I start drawing on data and I start asking you, does this resonate to you? Instead of trusting Kevin Howard and saying he seems to be a decent enough guy, it must be true or whatever. No, you know, what I'm asking you to do is to take the information, verify the data that you are unaware of, and then ask yourself based on your own lived experiences, because you would have gone through each of the scenarios we're talking about, right? Just like I did, right? Whether live or as a matter of history, right? But ask yourself, given the new information I've validated through my own verification method, does this resonate with my lived experience? If it does resonate with your lived experience, that's how you know it's true. Okay. So check and verify all data that you rely on, not just mine, but anyone in the marketplace. That's the first ask of this podcast. Two, make sure that as we have these conversations, that once you've validated the data, that you look to your life experiences and that you find out based on what you've experienced whether it resonates, so that you know what I'm saying is true. Okay? That's the basis by which we're going to build a new body of knowledge. We're going to build the breadcrumbs, the clues that are going to jigger our memories to remind us of what? This is the point of this podcast, to remind us of the people we are behind the cultural belief systems that we carry. These cultural belief systems that are defined by our prevailing virtues. In America, that is independence, freedom, self-interest, and competition. Just name a few, right? Reinforced by the prevailing narratives, all the explanations we were given for all the defining events of our lives. 9/11, the war in Iraq, the conflict in Gaza. I say it that way because we don't need to get into the details yet. We will get deep into it soon. But each of these narratives, the war in Ukraine, you know, the Great Recession, and whether it was home builder, whether it was people buying too much house that led to the crash of the housing market. All those things are the narratives that we were told that have defined how we see ourselves, see each other, and see the world, right? Okay. We're going to look at these things. We're going to test the metal of these things. We're going to verify what actually led to each of these major events, right? For the purpose of assessing to what extent are the virtues, values, and narratives that inform the belief systems, our cultural belief systems, that drive how we make choices, that drive how we build our lives. To what extent are they true? Because to the extent that they're not true, they hide who we are behind them. And so the breadcrumbs are for us to use our shared experiences, to use our shared humanity to assess whether the things that we have been told are actually true, so that we can find the clues that remind us of who we actually are. That's what I'm trying to do here. That's the conversation I'm trying to have here on Breadcrumbs. Not going to find that elsewhere. Okay. So that's that intro. Episode 1 is going to be about where are we in America today? And it and it looks like a whirlwind. So I'm going to distill where we are in America today down to 4 basic points. The fact that we elected Donald Trump to be we re-elected Donald Trump to be the president of the United States. 1. The fact that we are facing, literally, statistically, factually, easily verifiably, the worst housing affordability crisis in U.S. history right now. Two, that we are about to celebrate. We're about to pass the second anniversary of October 7th, 2023, where Hamas engaged in a terrorist attack against Israelis in Israeli territory, essentially, right? That led to the government of Israel responding with, with what I will claim up front is a verifiable genocide. And that genocide is ongoing. Okay. And we are participant in it. And we're paying for it. Okay. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is we are about to go through, we're entering year 4 of the war in Ukraine, right? And we it looks like we're in the process of exiting that war. And again, we have spent, or how about this? Our government has spent in excess of $125 billion of our tax dollars invested in that war. Okay. And then the fifth thing, and it's the worst kept secret, is the climate crisis, which we're now at the place once again where we don't think it's real. Okay. So this is where we are, but we need to get into each one of them. And what I'm going to do with each one of them is I'm going to reveal, right? Remind us what's the prevailing narrative that explains each one of them. And then what does the data that we can verify tell us about the narrative? Is it true? Is it not? Okay, so let's start with the fact that 77.3 million Americans elected Donald J. Trump once again to be president of the United States last November 2024. And okay, so now the prevailing narrative, primarily from the establishment media and the establishment members of both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, is that the people who elected Donald Trump are misogynists, are racist, sexist, homophobes, or fascists. I mean, this is what we were told. This is what we have continued to be told. Nowhere in that prevailing narrative is there an explanation, though, for the people who actually voted for Donald Trump when you look at them with a sober eye. So let's look at them. Okay, 77.3 million people. Okay. Now, I went to my chat GPT, use your own chatbot. And the reason why I love AI for this purpose is because it combs all available data and gives you the source when you ask it the questions, right? So, okay. So I wanted to know the voting trends for Donald Trump since he ran as the Republican nominee for president of the United States in 2016, 2020, and 2024. So what is the demographic voting trends across those 3 presidential elections for Donald J. Trump by demographics? So I'm going to read what those trends are so that you understand, so we get a picture first and foremost. I told you what the prevailing narrative, and you hold me in the comments, hold me account. If the prevailing narrative did not characterize the people who support Donald Trump, right, as how I described, please correct me in the comments. But that's basically the prevailing narrative that I have been exposed to, and we get the same media. We have the same establishment media. So here are the voting trends for Donald Trump. For men in 2016 voted for Donald Trump. 52% of all men voted for Donald Trump in the United States who voted in this 2016 election. In 2020, it was 53%. In 2024, it was 55%. Okay. Women In 2016, 41% of American women voted for Donald Trump. In 2020, it was 42%. In 2024, it was 45%. Okay. Whites, in 2016, it was 57%. In 2020, it was 58%. And in 2024, it was 57%. So pretty flat. Okay. Hispanics, in 2016, it was 28%. In 2020, it was 33%. In 2024, it was 46%. Okay. So from 28% all the way up to 46% for Hispanics. For blacks, it was 8% in 2016, 12% in 2020, and 13% in 2024. For Asians, it was 27% in 2016, 36% in 2020, and 54% in 2024. Now by age, voters 18 to 24 voted for Donald Trump, 35% in 2016, 31% in 2020, and 54% in 2024. Voters 24 to 29 voted for Donald Trump, 39% in 2016, 43% in 2020, and 53% in 2024. Voters aged 30 to 44 voted for Donald Trump, 41% in 2016, 46% in 2020, 47% in 2024. Voters 45 to 54 in 2016, 45 to 64, 52% in 2016, 50% in 2020, and 54% in 2024. And for voters over 65, 52% of voters voted for Donald Trump in 2016, 52% in 2020, and 50% in 2024. So I just cited to you every major demographic of the American electorate. Okay? About 150 million voters in 2024. Right? And every demographic trended towards Donald Trump in 2024. First and foremost. Okay. But there was more data. An assessment, CNN on the evening of the election, after they are, I don't remember if they called the election yet, but it wasn't like 11:30 at night, but Eastern time, but it was probably like that 9 to 11 range, and this is when the quants come out and they start dicing and splicing the nation. They put a chart up, and I want you to go to YouTube and search for CNN's, voting trend chart, because it was an amazing scene. And so that Quantmeister came out and they put this chart up on the car and they said it was a chart of all American counties in the United States. And what it listed was the voting trend between 2020 and 2024. And the voting trend showed at that time that the entire country, every county in the country, voted more for Donald Trump in 2024 than they did in 2020. I mean, this stuff is unprecedented, right? Now, the final data, because I always wanted to get the final data on that statistic, is 98% of the counties in America, LA County, 98% of the counties in America voted more for Donald Trump in 2024 than he did in 2020. But we're not done. All 7 battleground states. I mean, most of the country is pretty well embedded on the Republican side or the Democratic side. Right? There's usually a sliver that's battleground that they can go either way. There were 7 identified battleground states. And the election is usually decided on how those balances go, 5-2, 4-3, whatever. Donald Trump won all 7 battleground states. Now, these statistics that I'm pointing out have been obscured by the fact that you probably have heard that this was once again an extremely close election. Well, virtually all of our elections over the last several presidential cycles have been close elections. We're at a period in U.S. history where we really are a 51-49, 50-49 American electorate. That I mean, it's that razor tight. What makes the demographic and the voting trends unusual with 2024 is the support for Donald Trump was in every region of the country, across every demographic of the country, throughout the entire battleground states. Okay. An example of what I'm talking about, of the depth, even though the spread was thin, 2%, 3%, 4%, 1%, the spreads were thin, admittedly. But when they cut across every demographic of the country, every region of the country, the trend is supported in the deepest of blue, in the deepest of red, and everywhere in between. Okay. When you have an example like Starrs County, Texas, a border county, okay, the most Hispanic county in the United States, okay? Okay. 90, I believe it's 97%, 97 to 98% Hispanic. Okay. Starrs County, Texas voted for the Democratic nominee for president of the United States in every presidential election from 1896 to 2020 and voted for Donald J. Trump by 16% in 2024. Okay. So this is the data. Every measure of that builds into an electorate, that builds into a mandate, suggested that Donald J. Trump got the broadest, even if it was thin, the broadest mandate that an American president has gotten, probably since Reagan's 1984 landslide against Walter Mondale. I voted for Walter Mondale. Full disclosure. But Reagan won 49 states in 1984. Walter Mondale only won his home state of Minnesota. That election, we need to splice and dice the demographics to see if Reagan had that level of domination across all demographics. And he probably did. But that would be the only election I could think of that could match the breadth of the support from the American public. So America elected Donald Trump. Now, because it's so broad, I hope that this data, the data challenges the prevailing narrative that it was racist and misogynist and fascists and homophobes and all that, because it's that part of the demographic is in every electorate. Let's be candid, right? But historically, statistically, it's a sliver, right? This is not that is a totally inadequate description when your mandate, when your support cuts across the full breadth of the nation, every region of the nation, every demographic of the nation, every age group of the nation. Okay, so okay, but there is one unifying statistic that does reflect the Asians and the whites and the women and the blacks and whomever and Hispanics who voted for Donald Trump. There was a study done by, I believe it was the Heritage Foundation, but I will have the site in the notes for this podcast, that said, okay, For the counties that voted for Donald Trump, they represent 40% of the GDP of the country. And the counties that voted for Kamala Harris represent 60%. So let's think about that for a second. Again, Donald Trump got 49 point something percent of the vote, and Kamala Harris got 47% of the vote. So more people voted for Donald Trump, and yet they only represented 40% of the GDP of the country. What I suggest to you is this 40% is the disenfranchised American middle class and American working class. And they became disenfranchised based on the economics and the geopolitical strategy and plan and policies of the establishment Republican Party and the establishment Democratic Party since 1992. That is the neocons on the Republican side and the neoliberals on the Democratic side. And here we're going to name names. So the neocons are George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Mitt Romney, establishment Republicans. They tend to have complete contempt for Donald Trump. On the Democratic side, the neoliberals is Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and because she refused to distance herself, apparently Kamala Harris are the neoliberals. And the policies that disenfranchise the American middle class and the American working class over these last 32 years, 33 years since 1992, is globalization on the economic side and American hegemony. Okay? American hegemony. After the Soviet Union chose to stand down in the early 90s, we had an end to history opportunity where we could have just incorporated Russia and the former Eastern European Warsaw Pact countries who were part of the Soviet Union. We could have just incorporated them into the international community in the same way we did with Germany and Japan after World War II. That was the hope. People were writing about it. Go check 91, 90. People were talking end of history. Instead, what we decided to do, specifically what the Clinton administration decided to do, was to maintain Russia as an enemy anyway. And the rest is history. In other words, when the Soviet Union stood down, what we decided to do was say we are the only superpower standing, and we are going to run the world. And we're going to enforce our leadership around the world through the forever wars. So take note, we have been at war somewhere around the country, around the world since 1992. Right. And, and so that geopolitical strategy, along with globalization, has led to an economics that has left the middle class and the working class behind. I give you one data point from the U.S. Federal Reserve. In 2021, after almost 30 years of those policies, in 2021, for the first time in U.S. history, the top 1% of wealth and income earners in this country had more wealth and income than the American middle class. First time in U.S. history. That's how disenfranchised the middle class and the working class had become in these last 32 years. And so they're the ones who voted for Trump. So with all the vitriol that, quite frankly, Trump deserves, he invites, right? I will never forget who voted for him. He stands on the shoulders of 77.3 million Americans who have one nostril underneath the waterline because of the economics and the geopolitical policies of our American government for the last 33 years. Okay. So, first step, we got that out of the way. We reelected Donald J. Trump. And I've given you some food for thought. And again, in that respect, I want you to consider whether the prevailing narratives we were told in terms of, how we elected Donald Trump, whether that was true. Okay. The next thing is, and it is ancillary to why we elected Donald Trump. 40% GDP elected Donald Trump. We are facing the worst housing affordability crisis in U.S. history. And you would think, gosh, the Great Depression, right? So once again, we have gone through this together because it happened so fast. So let us go back to COVID in 2020. So we sheltered in place in COVID. We sheltered in place in April and a good deal of May. And slowly over the summer, June, July, we started opening up parts of the economy. By the way, when we shut down the economy, all the non-essential parts of the economy, literally it was up to 80% of the economy. So it was a huge portion that we had temporarily shut down while we sheltered in place to get our arms around COVID and the pandemic. Okay, so when we opened up the economy slowly over the course of fall of 2020 in the winter to open it full in the spring of 2021, okay, the median household, the median value of an American house was about $340,000 in January 2021, okay? And the prevailing 30-year fixed interest rate was 2.6%. Fixed for 30. Oh, 15-year interest rate was like 1.8%. Okay, that was January of 2021. By January of 2025, right, the median home value in the United States was about about 440,000. It had gone up 28.6% over that 4-year period, where typically you would get 4 to 6% appreciation per year. Like the 80-year historical average was like 4 to 6% per year. Well, for that 4-year period, it went up 28.6%. We will have an episode on how that happened. But nonetheless, we've experienced this together. Home prices exploded since we came out of COVID. Okay? All right. But home prices not only exploded, but the cost of borrowing, almost none of us buy the house cash. It's like 98% of the market is the finance market, or historically was the finance market. Not anymore. I assure you that. Okay. So if we're financing our mortgage and interest rates almost triple, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage peaked in 2023 at like 8% when it was 2.6% in January. I will speak to myself. I closed on a home in March of 2021, and my mortgage, my $518,000 mortgage was 2.5% fixed for 30. So I'm just giving you an idea. So I lived it. I know you've lived it. This was the reality. So those two data points by themselves. The value of the home has gone up almost 30%. And the cost of borrowing has nearly tripled. So that crushes affordability. Because if you run the numbers, because you're talking about getting for that average house, where once you were getting a $340,000 house at 2.6%, now you're getting same house, $440,000 house, right? At 6.9% as of January. I know right now here in the end of September, it's down to maybe about 6.4%, but it's radically higher than the 2.6%. So when you combine the fact that the purchase price is 30% higher, 28.6% higher, and then the cost of the borrowing is well over double, almost triple. You're talking about people buying houses where my mortgage, my mortgage for the $518,000 mortgage was literally was $2,138. And now and now you have people, you know, at the $400,000 level paying $4,800 for, $5,000. Okay. That has cratered the finance market, the capacity of, we're at the point where the average American middle class household cannot afford to buy a house in the average American city. That's where we are. In 1970, we had working class people who could buy a home. This is Hollywood imitating reality. Archie Bunker, All in the Family, Norman Leary's brilliant. Check him out. Archie Bunker was the everyman. White, non-college educated, union worker, longshoreman, worked on the dock, was able to own a home in Queens, New York. That's New York City. And send his daughter to college on his salary alone. There used to be a time the working class could own a home in America. Okay. We live at a time where the middle class cannot afford to buy a home in the average American city in America. That's where we are. Okay. So the housing affordability crisis and what it does. This is the thing about a free market. What it does in a free market where people can no longer afford to buy a house and they're living somewhere, so that means they're renting. What that advantages landlords and people who own rental properties is if they realize that you don't have an alternative because you can't afford the alternative, they escalate their prices. They get to charge monopoly prices. Yeah, because you have to live somewhere. And so rents are going through the roof. Now you have a situation where in many households, the rent is exceeding 40% of take-home pay. Now, I want to say, just for a historical reference, the historical affordability for housing, whether it's a mortgage or it's rent, is 30% of take-home pay. Okay, so this is where we are with American housing, and it's infected the rental market because people have no other choice but to rent, and now they're getting raked over the coals there too. So American households are increasingly in crisis, and we're talking about deep into the American middle class. This is no longer just a working poor problem. This is no longer just an indigent problem. This is the heart of the American middle class through the indigent. And so this is crisis time in America. So that's the economics that led to the election of Donald J. Trump. Okay, we will get into what he's doing and what he's trying to do and what he's not doing and all that stuff in future episodes. But this is about talking about where we are. So that's the first big piece. Okay. Now we move to the second anniversary of Hamas's terrorist attack on Israel, killing 1,100 Israelis, 1,100 and change, and taking 252 hostages. Horrible, horrible event. The entire prevailing narrative that we've gotten because of that event is that what Israel is doing is because they were attacked on October 7th, 2023. They have a right to defend themselves, and everything they're doing right now is exercising that right in order so that they can protect themselves from being attacked again. This has been said by our president. This has been said by the president, the Biden administration at the time was the president of the United States. This is what the administration said. This is what the spokespeople were told to say. This is what the establishment media has said. In fact, the only justification any of us has been given for what Israel is doing in Gaza is that Israel has a right to defend herself against the attack, the terrorist attack of Hamas on October 7th. Okay, so let's first deal with the issue of whether it is a genocide. And this is, once again, what's the narrative? Okay, so we're told it can't be a genocide because Israel's only defending herself. Again, there is no one in the establishment media or our government prior to this administration. I'm not talking about Trump. He has a different take. We can talk about that. But in terms of the prevailing narrative, everything has been, this is an act of self-defense. And Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel has a right to exist. And if they don't defend themselves, they won't exist. So therefore, they're doing what needs to be done, right? And unfortunately, in war, kids get killed, women get killed, innocents get killed, and that's what we've been told. Now, so that we understand that Israel could not do any of this without the billions of dollars of historical support from us. So we're paying for this. Now, under U.S. law, it's strictly forbidden for us to provide arms or to support militarily, logistically, or what have you, any actor who's engaged in human rights violations. That's strictly prohibited under U.S. law. Okay, so let's look at what Israel is doing to see if there are human rights violations. Okay, so the country of South Africa in December of 2023 brought a claim of, that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And they presented an 86-page document with their evidence supporting their claim. And Israel was compelled and did defend themselves in this case is still going on. Okay. So the document that controls whether or not Israel is engaged in genocide is the Genocide Convention. This document was originally agreed to in 1947. And it was an international treaty. But every signature had to go and ratify the treaty through their national process. So in America, under U.S. constitutional law, the Senate has to pass it by, I believe, a 2/3 vote in the Senate. The irony of the situation is the Genocide Convention was ratified in the 1980s, in the late 1980s. It may have been 1988, but the late 1980s, led by the senior senator from Delaware, who happened to be Joe Biden. Okay, so the Genocide Convention is only 4 pages. Please go into your search engine, get the PDF of the Genocide Convention, and take a read. Okay, it's actual English. It's in English. It's easy to understand. Okay, it lays out what the definition of genocide is, and it's a complicated. It is a complicated definition in terms of proving it in the court of law, because it is the crime of crimes. The Genocide Convention was inspired by the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, right? So this was the crime of crimes, and the effort and the idea was for it to be articulated and adjudicated in a way that it would prevent these things from happening. Okay, so we have the source document, the genocide, and under U.S. law, the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution give and how it's been interpreted gives a hierarchy of U.S. law, with all laws that fall below having to defer to the higher authority. So that hierarchy of law is the U.S. Constitution, treaties that have been ratified, two-thirds vote in the Senate, federal law, state law, municipal law. Okay. So since the Genocide Convention has been ratified by the United States Senate and is an official treaty, it is one level right below the Constitution and it exceeds all federal laws. Right. Okay. So when you go read that 4-page document, you'll be shocked when you compare it versus what we've been told and what we're actually doing. Okay. Right. So again, it's a very simple defense that Israel has posed that President Biden gave as justification, right? And that his spokesperson. So because I told you, South Africa brought this case in the International Court of Justice against Israel. Israel's defending themselves in the case. And one of the first stages of a court case is you have discovery. So so someone brings the claim, this person did this to this person. Now the claim is filed, and then and both sides are represented, and then you have a period of time where all parties involved provide all the evidence that they have that pertain to the conflict at issue, to whatever is in dispute. All the relevant facts that either side have, they have to offer it up in discovery so that everyone has all the evidence for or against the claim that's being made. And so that's what South Africa did, and Israel brought all their evidence for their defense, and they offered it. And then at the end of discovery, it's a standard practice, particularly for the party who feels that the other party's evidence is wholly inadequate. So if it's the person bringing the claim, South Africa could have filed a request for summary judgment in favor of their claim that Israel is guilty of genocide. In reverse, if Israel feels that South Africa did not present sufficient evidence to bring this case to the full trial, it's called prima facie. That the evidence that they presented does not meet the requirements of the law on its face, based how it's written, base threshold level. Okay, then the court would be empowered, if they granted a summary judgment against, to throw the case out. Okay, so the International Court of Justice was going to issue their decision on January 26, 2024. And before that decision, the spokesperson for the National Security Council, Admiral Kirby, representing President Biden and the Biden administration, made a statement. And he said, South Africa's case of genocide against Israel is baseless and without merit. I mean, do we need to get out the dictionary? Right. So the official position of the United States, right, viewing South Africa's 86-page filing with all their evidence, was that it was baseless. There was nothing, there was no evidence, and it was without merit. No reasonable person under any circumstances could conclude, based on what they're saying, that Israel committed genocide. Okay, that was a part of the narrative, the prevailing narrative. Why? Because it's self-evident that Israel can't be committing genocide when they are only responding to the terrorist attack of Hamas that killed 1,100 Israelis and took 252 hostages. So anything they do in response can't be genocide. That was the narrative. Okay, here's another moment. Go to your chat bot, go to your search engine, and pull the report. There is video, okay, of what the International Court of Justice decided on January 26, 2024, right? So set it up. Only there are 15 judges on the International Court of Justice. They added 2 more judges. They added the Israeli judge, and they added a judge from South Africa, because those are the countries who were one was bringing the claim, one was defending against. So you had 17 judges, and the president of the court, or the chief judge, which is rotated, was Judge Donahue of the United States. Okay, so Judge Donahue read the decision of the court. Please go check that. You need to check that. I'm just going to give you the highlights. Okay, so a majority of the 17 would be sufficient, just like in our Supreme Court of 9 judges, a 5-4 decision is sufficient to be a majority, and that sets the law. So for this 17, all they need 9 of the 17 to rule one way or the other, that grant summary judgment in favor of Israel and throw the case out. Grant summary judgment. Well, I don't believe South Africa requested summary judgment for the decision to be. Maybe they did. I'm not sure, but I don't remember that, because if they were requested it. But that's the range of choices. Or oftentimes, for most cases, summary judgment is not granted. And the reason why is because there is sufficient evidence to have a full trial. And the bottom line is that is what the court decided. But I want you to understand the detail of what they decided. They decided by a vote of 15-2, including the U.S. judge. Suffice it to say, the Israeli judge was a part of the 2. And I think Uganda was part of it. And the funny thing about the Ugandan judge is she voted no. She voted in favor. If it was the Ugandan judge, it was. I have to check that. You check it. Hold me accountable, right? They voted for Israel in all these cases. They were the odd vote, even when they were by themselves. They were the odd vote. So something happened there. I don't know, but the Israeli judge voted against this. 15-2. The court held that South Africa had presented sufficient evidence of genocide, that it was more likely than not, based on what South Africa had presented, that Israel had committed genocide. Okay. They didn't stop. They didn't stop there, because that's normally what you would do, and then they would set the case to start, and then you would have this multi-year process, which has been ongoing. But they said, based on the evidence that South Africa has presented, that the harm to the Palestinian people was so severe that it compelled the court to grant emergency measures. In American parlance, this was like an emergency injunction. Okay. And then they had these rulings by a 16-1 decision, including the Israeli judge. The court said that Israel was engaged, that the Israeli government and members of their media that South Africa had established, that they were engaged in inciting genocide. They were engaged in inciting genocide. And that they had a duty to punish, to not only stop inciting genocide, but to punish the actors who had been inciting genocide. That was done 16-1 with the Israeli judge. By 16-1, they ordered Israel to stop blocking humanitarian aid to Gaza, including the Israeli judge, by 16-1. By 15-2, they ordered Israel to stop harming the Israeli civilian population in, by the definitions of genocide under the Genocide Convention. 15-2. The Israeli judge did not agree with that one. But it's 15-2. The American judge did agree. It's the same. So this was the decision of the court on January 26, 2024. So now compare the narrative that we have been told by our government at that time, that Israel is only defending themselves. They have a right to defend themselves against the attack against Hamas, the terrorist attack against Hamas, and therefore whatever they're doing is fine and does not violate U.S. law. How could it be a human rights violation, right, if they're only defending themselves? Well, it's important to point out this was the basis of Israel's defense, that which in their view justified summary judgment. They can't be guilty of genocide if they're only defending themselves. The court roundly rejected that, because if you go into the 4-page document of the Genocide Convention, unlike murder, there's no provision in the Genocide Convention that provides an exception that allows you to commit genocide for a justifiable reason. There's no such provision in the Genocide Convention. Now, for you lawyers out there, and you're right, the exceptions usually come out of the common law. The common law is how the courts interpret the statute or the treaty. So let's look to the common law, because self-defense came out of the common law for as a defense for murder. The courts decided that if you murdered someone and you couldn't get away and you had no other choice and you murdered a person defending yourself, that you would be absolved, right? Okay. Well, we have numerous cases brought by the International Court of Justice for genocide against other countries historically. And nowhere in there has the court ever established it's the crime of crimes. Court never, in their decision, specifically in their decision on January 26th, the International Court of Justice did not say that Israel didn't order Israel into a ceasefire. They didn't reach to whether Israel had a right to defend themselves against Hamas. The issue was the indiscriminate murder, slaughter of Palestinian civilians. To take a densely populated city and drop a 2,000-pound bomb. By perspective, in the urban warfare in the war in Iraq, U.S. ordnance was limited to 500 pounds in the city because of the concussive force that would kill so many civilians beyond your target, right? And Israel is using 2,000-pound bombs. The indiscriminate murder of innocent civilians, all types. So this is what the court is finding, and why the court said, yeah, there is evidence here of genocide. But it's not only that. The evidence is so strong that we have to impose an emergency injunction, emergency provisions to try to protect the Palestinian people. Now, by the way, we have together, you and I have experienced, how did Israel respond to the court's ruling? By the way, Israel ratified the Genocide Convention, just like we did, just like all the European countries did, right? Okay. Have they stopped blocking humanitarian aid? Have they stopped hurting and indiscriminately killing Palestinian civilians? I mean, how many members of the media, the medical hospitals that have been killed since that ruling? So believe me, the case against Israel is only more severe. The court is about to decide over the next some months. And it's as certain as these things go that Israel will be determined to be guilty of genocide, not only because of what South Africa brought to the court when they filed the case, and that was just based on what Israel did in November and like the first half of December, but what they've done since and what we've seen with our own eyes. And 4 times under the Biden administration, we used our United Nations Security Council veto to prevent over 150 nations from being able to force Israel into a ceasefire. And tragically, the Trump administration has continued that practice at least once and maybe twice. Unbelievable. So that's the genocide in Gaza. That's on our hands. The war in Ukraine, once again, in February of 2022, we were told that Russia's attack on Ukraine was unprovoked, was a naked aggression against a sovereign nation, and that we, as believers of democracy, and Ukraine is a democracy. I mean, Zelensky was elected, right? We had to come to their defense. So we were told. I want to defer you to one person as an authority. I'm not an authority, but I want you to check out this person. His name is Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is a developmental economist. And I think he's the most important developmental economist in modern history. Jeffrey Sachs was the person we sent to the Warsaw Pact as the Soviet Union was dismantling. We sent him to Eastern Europe to help those former communist countries transition to free market economies. And when the Soviet Union finally dissolved, we sent him to Russia to work with the Russian leadership, Boris Yeltsin, to try to help them transition to a free market capitalist society. Yeah, if you didn't get that from our prevailing narrative, one of the things the Soviet Union agreed to do, one of the things Gorbachev agreed to do when they agreed to stand down and bring all their nukes back to Russia, was to disavow communism. They agreed to be capitalistic. Well, that's absolute victory for us, right? Okay, so we sent Jeffrey Sachs there to help them make that transition. We will have a discussion about all that in a full episode on its own. But I refer you, once again, you can get this on YouTube, to an address that Jeffrey Sachs gave to the European Parliament in February, March of 2025 on the history that led to the war in Ukraine. But suffice it to say, the narrative that we were told, that this was Putin's unprovoked attack against the sovereign nation of Ukraine. That is what we were told. That justified us paying over $125 billion in support for the Ukrainians, right? If you go into your chatbot and you check out what Jeffrey Sachs, the history he's going to tell, because he was a man in the room. This is put that way. It will blow your mind how profoundly we were lied to. So, okay, I'm just going to give you the high points because I wrote commentaries about this. They're going to be in the description notes for this episode 1. And let me take a break for a second and say, The companion source material for a lot of the topics we're going to discuss over the course of this podcast is my book, Onward at Last, the 2024 Presidential Election Edition, published by Atmosphere Press and re-released in October 2024. The book can be purchased on Amazon or where books are sold. Ingram distributes it, so it's everywhere. So you can get it anywhere. But you can also go to my website, and if you can't afford to buy the book because you want it to reference, if you go to https:// onwardatlast.com, right? On the blog tab, you can access all the commentaries that discuss in great detail, like it's in the book, for free. Because this is information all of us need to get exposed to. This is public information. All of us need to get exposed to it. Only reason I charge for the book is the only way to get it into Ingram, only way to get it into the best distribution system so people can get access to it, because they charge for those things. So therefore, you have to charge something over it. Okay, so that's okay. But back to Ukraine. So I'm not going to get into the entire history, but I will just say this. Okay, it goes back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev negotiating with H.W. Bush, President H.W. Bush, and James Baker, Secretary of State Baker. The deal that the Soviet Union offered, because their hardliners wanted to go to nuclear war. They said, we're losing on the conventional. They lost in Afghanistan. It broke the spirit of the Red Army. So they knew they couldn't defeat us conventionally. But they have this massive nuclear arsenal. The hardliners said, well, we're not going down without a fight. Gorbachev was the adult in the room saying, well, hold it. We have learned from the Americans that they can be graceful to an enemy in defeat. And all we need to do is look to the Germans and look to the Japanese. So Gorbachev made a deal that instead of going to nuclear war, which both sides would lose, the Soviet Union would agree to stand down voluntarily. Now, we had nuclear nonproliferation treaties with the Soviet Union. For those treaties to be valid, they had to survive with someone. They survived with Russia, which meant that all the nukes, those in Ukraine that were in different areas of the Soviet Union, had to go back to Russia because Russia was responsible for honoring the treaties. That's the international law and the transition of nations that occurred. Okay. So the deal Gorbachev asked for, he said, listen, we will relinquish our control over Eastern Europe and the entire empire of the Soviet Union and pull back all our resources to Russia, including all the nukes and all the WMDs, and make sure they do not get in the hands of terrorists. Further, they said, as a part of pulling back control over Eastern Europe and the Warsaw Pact, they were relinquishing control of East Germany. Now, let us be clear. Germany killed upwards of 27 million Soviets in World War II. We are going to talk about that in another podcast. Episode. Okay. But here, Gorbachev is saying, look, we will relinquish control of East Germany, and we will support the reunification of Germany as a member of NATO. But what we are asking is that NATO doesn't expand east of Germany. Further, we will abdicate communism and switch to free market capitalism in the hopes that America would integrate us into the international system in the same way they integrated Germany and Japan. Okay. That's the deal we agreed to. We agreed to that. That was a great deal. It was absolute victory for us. Why? Because they were going to be a capitalist. Communism was dead. They were going to control all their nukes, right? It wasn't going to get in the hands of the terrorists. They were going to support NATO taking in the full Germany, reunify Germany. And we did it. And James Baker said, okay, he gave them a private assurance. Now, private assurance is a promise that one country makes to another. And it usually is used in or as a usually a face-saving mechanism. It's not a new thing. But the Soviet Union and the United States have a very famous example where a private assurance saved the world. At the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the official narrative, the official deal that ended the crisis was that Soviet Union agreed to remove their nuclear missiles from Cuba in exchange for the United States promising that they would never attack Cuba again. Because remember, Bay of Pigs, we attacked Cuba, tried to overthrow Castro in 61. Okay? So here we're agreeing we will never try to overthrow Castro in Cuba again. And the Soviets would agree to remove their nuclear missiles out of Cuba. That was the official deal. And that's what most of us knew. That was the prevailing narrative. But there was a private assurance. Kennedy gave Nikita Khrushchev a private assurance that secretly, if they did the deal, 6 months later, the United States would remove our nuclear missiles out of Turkey. Yeah, the rest of the damn story. The Cuban Missile Crisis was caused because in 1961, the United States put intercontinental nuclear missiles in Turkey that had Moscow in its range. So after we attacked and tried to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs and failed, and Castro made a nuclear defense treaty with the Soviet Union felt perfectly obliged, even though they hid it, to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Why? Because we did it to them first in Turkey. So the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis was to allow the Soviets to look like they backed down. Because basically the deal was they were going to just move the missiles, and we promised we'll never attack Castro again. When the reality was, the linchpin of that deal was 6 months later we were going to move the nuclear missiles out of Turkey. And it's interesting, if you read the autobiography of Khrushchev, he admits that deal got done because he trusted President Kennedy. See, that's the value of talking to your enemies. Well, so there was a history of the use of a private assurance. So when Gorbachev was told by James Baker, the U.S. Secretary of State, that the United States gives them a private assurance, and this is a quote, NATO will not expand 1 inch east of Germany. They had every reason to believe us. So awful was the betrayal of Russia/Soviet Union by what we did thereafter, that all the way to last year, when in a 2-hour interview with Vladimir Putin, Putin said, and I have a commentary about this interview because it was a great interview and you should listen to it. Putin said America tricked Russia in the 1990s. And you would, for a world leader to use that kind of word, tricked. Why? Because it's critically important in international diplomacy that even adversaries honor their word. Because if you don't honor your word, the escalatory implications are unspeakable. You you have no trust. Okay. So what did we do? Well, since that agreement was made, okay, NATO has expanded to include every country of the Warsaw Pact and three provinces of the former Soviet Union. And in 2008, George W. Bush announced publicly at the NATO summit in the spring of 2008 of NATO's intention of expanding east to include Ukraine. And Putin, who has been running Russia since 2000, sent a secret communique that was leaked later by WikiLeaks to the U.S. ambassador to Russia, saying very clearly that the entire political class of Russia views the expansion of NATO to the Russian border in Ukraine as an existential threat to the national security of Russia that Russia would go to nuclear war to prevent. Okay. And our U.S. ambassador's memo back to the president, President Bush, famously titled "Niet" means "Niet." No means no, right? Yeah. Okay. Now fast forward to Obama. Yeah, Miss Professorial Obama. In 2014, there was a democratically elected president of Ukraine. And in early February of 2014, the Assistant Secretary of State responsible for Eastern Europe, Victoria Nuland, Obama's Assistant Secretary of State, was caught on tape by the Russians. By the way, it's on YouTube. You can hear it yourself. Victoria Nuland was caught on tape in early February 2014 talking to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, explaining to the U.S. ambassador the names of the government that we were about to install after the violent overthrow of the democratically elected NATO neutral president of Ukraine. And she named the names. And then by the end of February, there was a violent overthrow. And the president of Ukraine, who is duly elected by the sovereign people of Ukraine, had to flee to Russia to save his life. And the people we predicted took control. And what those people did was they started purging the country of ethnically Russian Ukrainians. They banned the Russian Orthodox Church, the Russian religion. They banned the Russian language, all expressions of Russian culture. And when the ethnically Russian Ukrainians resisted in Donbass and the southeast regions, they started slaughtering them. Yeah, the government that we installed, right, under Obama. Right. And then the Russian, it was getting so bad. The Russians invaded then, right, to protect ethnically Russian Ukrainians. And they successfully protected them. Yeah. That's, and so, and they came to an agreement with Ukraine called the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement. It was sponsored by Germany, France, and Poland, and approved by the United Nations Security Council, including the United States and China, right? Security Council, okay. And the Minsk II agreement was a peace treaty to say, okay, we're going to continue to keep Ukraine, the integrity of Ukraine, yes, but we're going to protect ethnically Russian Ukrainians and their culture against the Ukrainian government's intent to ban ethnic Russian culture from Ukraine. So they were protected, sort of like a supremacy clause state a federalism type situation where they had the autonomy as it relates to their culture and their cultural practices. Right. So this was an agreement that the Russians signed with the Ukrainians, right? And was sponsored by Germany, France, and Poland, and approved by the United Nations Security Council. And then we promptly told Ukraine, well, you don't really have to abide by this agreement. And so they never did. And during this time, we started building, it was on the front page of the New York Times last year. We started building secret military bases in Ukraine and started fortifying Ukraine with NATO grade weapons and training. And Russia was watching us. Remember what they said in 2008, what Putin said. So by 2021, they moved their forces to the Ukrainian border. And then Putin sends a communique in December 2021 to the NATO Secretary General asking for a summit to negotiate with NATO and the NATO powers on the security question of Ukraine joining NATO. And it's a matter of public record how NATO responded. NATO said, and the Secretary General has said subsequently, said it publicly. They responded privately, but he said it publicly, and you could find this quote. He basically said, NATO expansion is not the business of Russia, even to their border. Even though we gave them the private assurance that we wouldn't expand east of Germany, 1 inch east of Germany. Here, they have their forces on the Ukrainian border, and they're asking one last time before we go to war, right? Can we have a summit on this question? Because this violates our national security by you expanding NATO all the way to our border. And that's how we responded. So I want you to verify everything I said. There is no way. I mean, there's math on this. It's called 180 degrees. The absolute opposite of the narrative we were told. That Russia's attack on Ukraine in February of 2022 was unprovoked, was a naked aggression on the part of Putin and Russia against the sovereign people of Ukraine. The exact opposite is true. We violated the sovereign people of Ukraine when we, and Jeffrey Sachs will explain how he knows, we paid for the violent overthrow under Obama of the democratically elected NATO neutral president of Ukraine, and installed these people who proceeded to start slaughtering ethnically Russian Ukrainians and banning their culture from Ukraine. That has led us to the war between Ukraine and Russia. You can't get more diametrically opposed to the narrative than the truth in this case, right? And so I just want to say the implications of our own government, Biden, both sides, Bush, Obama, all of them telling this story of this unprovoked attack, encouraging us to support Ukraine in this attack to the tune of over $125 billion. When the truth of the matter is, we instigated it from the beginning because we broke a basic promise in the peace settlement between the former Soviet Union and the United States. It, so that's the next big one. And the final one, and we won't spend hardly any time on it, is the climate crisis. Yeah, I know you've heard all types of nonsense, all types of spin, all types. Some of you believe it, some of you think it's crap and stuff like that, but whatever. Certainly, the president kindly to say he's a climate denier is, I think, kind. He's a climate denier. There's nothing wrong with that. He doesn't see that this is a problem. Okay. What I'm going to say here, though, what I'm going to say here that that this is in fact a climate crisis that our lived experience sees, right? It is not by accident the escalation of severe weather events in our lifetimes that most of us can't remember a disaster of the magnitude of Hurricane Andrew before Andrew. But then you have Andrew, you have Northridge, you have Katrina, you have, I mean, on and on and on. New York almost flood. I mean, okay, that's one sign of the evidence of the severe weather events. You know, no matter what people think in the state of Florida, if you own a home and you need homeowners insurance, you're finding that you're having a problem because the actuaries don't care about the politics, right? Yes, the severe weather effects in Florida and in California are getting to the point where the insurance industry is abandoning those states because the exposure you cannot underwrite properly the exposure of to extreme weather events that are escalating both in California and in Florida and along the Gulf Coast, right? If you know a farmer, if you enjoy wine, talk to anyone about their crop yields, right? If you're one of the states that draw from the Colorado River water system in the southwestern United States, you understand that the water levels are getting to all time lows, and every state is having to take a shave as to how much they can draw, right? These are all evidence of the weather events that are causing catastrophic impacts, and we're just getting started. So I will just, for the sake of this conversation, to wrap it up because it's been a long episode one, say this: no topic has the global, authoritative, comprehensive consensus than human-induced climate change. And the evidence of that is the 2023 climate change. I'm going to read it because I want to get the title. I want to get the title right. Yeah, yeah. It's yes. Climate Change 2023 Synthesis Report Summary for Policymakers, prepared by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Right. Okay. This document is 42 pages long. This has the most definitive scientific determinations on on the cause of the climate change, on how we can adapt for the climate change, and how we can mitigate, how we can reduce the overall impacts coming from climate change. And every page of this document has been supported by all 195 member nations of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. This is the not-for-profit scientists from 195 member nations. So to give you some understanding, there's only 193 member nations of the United Nations. So all of them, plus two additional nations who have not yet been recognized by the United Nations, but were members of the World Meteorological, the WMO organization, which is a predecessor to the IPCC. They all unanimously agree for what's in this 42-page document. The link is going to be in the description notes for this podcast. Check it out. Print you a copy so that you can see. This is beyond debate. This is humanity's understanding of how we got here in climate, where this is going, how we can adapt for it, and how we can minimize, how we can avoid the worst catastrophic climate-related impacts because we're running out of time. We will do a whole episode just on climate. So this is the picture of where we are today. And my takeaway to you in episode 1 is, as you listen and re-listen to this podcast and go and verify the sources, go check out my sources, use your chat bot, use your search engines to check out what I'm saying. Compare the contrast consistently between the prevailing narrative that we're told and the factual data that you can verify, and see that the cavernous difference between what we're told and what is true cannot be accidental. It is intentional. It is the intent to manipulate how we see these things, in order to manipulate how we vote, in order for us to manipulate how we feel about people who we think are our enemies, on and on. This is the first major breadcrumb to help jog our memories of who we are behind cultural belief systems that have been fortified by every one of these narratives and the virtues that underlie them. Thank you so much for your time today. This is Breadcrumbs. If you want to join our community, please go over to Patreon, search for Breadcrumbs, and feel free. You could do a free membership, but there are tiers of membership there. Participate in the community, because I want you to be a part of this conversation. And the ways that you can participate expand when you go and join our community at Patreon. Here on YouTube or Spotify or wherever we are, your participation is limited to the comments, and I will try to be responsive in those comments. But if you join us over at Patreon, right, then you can email me directly. And if you email me directly, holding me to account for this and that, I'll have a correction in a future episode. I will communicate with you, that type of thing. And we can incorporate you into this conversation, because this is not intended to be a monologue. This is intended to be an interactive, engaging conversation about the issues that have been so impactful in our lives. And the ultimate is this. As you engage in this conversation through future episodes, through your comments and your email and our communication, you're going to be inspired to want to contribute content to our discussion. This is the ultimate goal of this podcast, which is to expand the scope of our social discourse. The tragedy of our social discourse is we are hardly involved in the conversation about the things that affect our lives. It's always a bunch of talking heads who chattering class, experts and such, who don't live the lives we live and are not affected by these things in the same way that we're affected, yet they frame all the discussions from their narrow bubble perspective, right? And we never can get in. That is not what we're going to do here. I encourage you, if you have content, if you want to engage in discussion, you will be able to, once you join our community on Patreon, you will be able to email me and pitch me on your ideas. We will have that discussion. I am not going to prescreen you. I'm just going to make sure that it's substantive, it's appropriate, it's relevant to what we're talking about, and that the community would find it compelling, right? That's all I'm going to be doing. And if that's the case, you're going to come on the show. We're going to do it in whatever way we can to allow you to share your content and so that the community can benefit. Okay, so these are all the things that you'll find when you go on Patreon. So thank you for today, and well, follow the breadcrumbs. Take care.